Was it possible to own a city? Could a single man hold the soul of millions in the palm of his hand, a metropolis of glass and steel and shadow, his personal kingdom? For Damien Blackwood, the question was not theoretical. It was a fact, written in the blood of his rivals and the ink of his contracts. He was the architect of ruin, a name whispered in the darkest corners of the underworld and the most opulent boardrooms. His office was a testament to his nature. It was less a room and more a void, perched at the apex of a skyscraper that tore a hole in the clouds. The walls were obsidian, the floor polished black marble, the furniture a collection of sharp, minimalist angles in chrome and leather. It smelled of nothing, not of paper or coffee or life. It smelled of power, which has no scent at all. Damien stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, a silhouette in a bespoke suit the color of a midnight storm. The city sprawled below him, a glittering carpet of trapped stars, each light a life, a story, a debt. To him, they were merely assets on a balance sheet. He held a crystal tumbler, the amber liquid within untouched. His focus was on the reflection in the glass. Not his own, but the reflection of the man kneeling on the marble behind him. The man was named Alistair Finch. He had been, until 10 minutes ago, a titan of industry. Now he was just a stain on Damien's perfect floor. "You made a mistake, Alistair." Damien's voice was low, a rumble of distant thunder that promised a storm. It was not angry. It was colder than that. It was the voice of consequence. Alistair trembled, his expensive suit ruined by sweat and terror. "Please, Damien." It was a miscalculation, a simple error. Damien turned slowly. His movements were liquid, precise, predatory. His face was a mask carved from stone, all sharp jawline and severe brows. His eyes were the color of a frozen lake, hiding unfathomable depths and a chilling emptiness. "An error," Damien repeated, the words tasting like ash in the sterile air. "You call skimming 3% from my shipping consolidations an error. You moved my assets without my permission. You thought I would not notice." He took a step closer. "I notice everything." The air crackled with a silent, screaming tension. Damien was not just a businessman. He was a kingpin, a phantom who controlled the city's arteries, its ports, its unions, its hidden streams of money and violence. To steal from him was not theft. It was suicide. Standing by the door, a mountain of muscle and loyalty in a suit that strained at the shoulders, was Julian. His face was a stoic landscape of scars, his eyes missing nothing. He was Damien's enforcer, his shadow, the physical manifestation of his will. He did not move. He did not need to. His presence was a promise of swift and brutal finality. Damien stopped in front of Alistair, looking down at the broken man. "I built my empire on a simple principle, Alistair. Absolute loyalty. Anything less is a liability." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was a physical weight. "And liabilities," he whispered, "are liquidated." He did not need to raise his voice. He simply nodded, a barely perceptible motion toward Julian. He turned back to the window, to his kingdom of light and shadow, as Julian stepped forward. He did not watch what happened next. He did not need to. He had already calculated the outcome. The only sound was a soft, final sigh. Then the quiet returned, deeper and more absolute than before. This was his world. A world of power, of fear, of cold, hard transactions. He felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not regret. Just the sterile hum of control. Emotion was a weakness, a flaw in the architecture of power he had so meticulously constructed. He had buried his heart long ago, in the same cold ground as the adoptive parents, who had shown him a flicker of warmth before the world snuffed them out. His real mother, he had been told, had abandoned him on the steps of an orphanage, a piece of human refuse. He had accepted it as the first, cruelest transaction of his life. He ran a thumb over a small silver frame on his desk, the only personal item in the entire void. A faded photograph of a woman with kind eyes, his adoptive mother. His single, haunting memory of what love was supposed to feel like. A vulnerability he kept locked away, even from himself. He was a monster, a king. And he was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Hundreds of miles away, in the city's forgotten, grimy underbelly, the world smelled very different. It smelled of bleach, desperation, and lukewarm soup. Elara Vance felt the exhaustion deep in her bones, a heavy, leaden thing that had settled into her marrow. Her white nurse's uniform was clean but frayed at the cuffs, her shoes worn so thin she could feel the cold of the linoleum floor through the soles. She was on the 18th hour of a double shift at the Northgate Eldercare facility, a place where the city sent its elderly to be forgotten on a budget. The fluorescent lights hummed a weary, monotonous song, casting a pale, sickly glow on everything. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She already knew what it was. A text from her landlord. Rent past due. Final notice. The words screamed in capital letters, each one a tiny hammer blow against her already crumbling composure. A wave of dizziness washed over her. The rent for the tiny, drafty apartment she shared with her younger brother, Leo. Leo, who was brilliant, who was her entire world, who was halfway through an engineering degree on the back of her double shifts and sleepless nights. A frail, bird-like hand clutched at her sleeve. "Dearie, is it time for my story?" Elara blinked away the panic and forced a warm, genuine smile onto her face. She turned to Mrs. Gable, a woman of 93 years, whose mind was a beautiful, tangled garden of memories that no longer bloomed in the right season. "Of course, Eleanor. Let's get you tucked in." She guided the old woman back to her bed, her touch infinitely gentle. She ignored the ache in her back, the burn in her feet, the knot of fear in her stomach. Here, in this room, she was not a woman drowning in debt. She was a comfort, a small, steady light in the encroaching dark. "You have kind hands," Mrs. Gable murmured, her eyes clouded with cataracts, finding Elara's. "Like an angel." Elara's heart ached. Kindness was the only currency she had, and it paid no bills. It did not keep the electricity on or buy textbooks for Leo. But it was who she was. It was the unbreakable core of her, a quiet defiance against a world that had tried so hard to crush her. She worked for 2 more hours, her movements automatic, her mind racing. She needed a second job, a third. She would work until she dropped. For Leo. For the sliver of hope he represented. She was the unbreakable dove, flying on tired wings against a hurricane of debt and despair. The next day, desperation led her to the gleaming, sterile halls of the Blackwood Medical Center, a jewel of modern medicine funded by the city's most enigmatic philanthropist, Damien Blackwood. She was there for an interview, a long shot, for a private nursing position she was wildly underqualified for, but paid a salary that made her heart stop. As she waited in the vast marble lobby, a commotion erupted near the entrance. A woman, exquisitely dressed in a crimson dress that probably cost more than Elara's annual salary, was shouting, "Get this! This vagrant out of here! This is a high-class establishment, not a shelter!" The woman was Isabella Thorne, daughter of a shipping magnate, and, it was whispered, Damien Blackwood's unofficial fiancé. Her target was a small elderly woman in a threadbare coat, her hair a wild silver halo. The old woman was confused, muttering to herself, her eyes wide with fear and disorientation. She looked lost, utterly lost. The security guards looked uncertain, caught between Isabella's venomous command and the pitiful sight of the old woman. "She's frightening the patrons," Isabella shrieked, her voice sharp and brittle. "Remove her! Now!" Something inside Elara snapped. It was the injustice, the cruelty, the sight of the powerful preying on the weak. It was everything she fought against in her own small way, every single day. Before she could think, she was moving. She walked calmly, deliberately, placing herself between Isabella and the old woman. "She's just confused," Ilara said, her voice quiet but firm, a stark contrast to Isabella's screech. "She's not hurting anyone." Isabella turned her fury on Ilara, her eyes raking over Ilara's simple, cheap dress with blatant disdain. "And who are you? The welcoming committee for the destitute? Get out of my way." Ilara stood her ground. She knelt down, bringing herself to the old woman's eye level. "Hello," she said softly, her voice the one she used for Mrs. Gable. "My name is Ilara. Are you lost?" The old woman flinched, but then her frantic eyes met Ilara's, and something in their depths seemed to settle. A flicker of recognition, a moment of calm in her inner storm. I don't know," the old woman whispered, her voice raspy. "That's all right," Ilara soothed, ignoring the fuming socialite behind her. "We'll figure it out together." It was in that moment that the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air in the lobby grew heavy, cold. A silence fell, so sudden and absolute that it was louder than Isabella's shouting had been. A figure had emerged from a private elevator, flanked by the mountain of a man named Julian. It was Damien Blackwood. He had been watching, silently, from the shadows. His frozen lake eyes were not on the beautiful, furious Isabella. They were not on the security guards. They were fixed, with a shocking, piercing intensity, on Ilara. He watched her, this girl in a cheap dress, as she shielded a forgotten old woman from the cruelty of his world. He saw her defiance, her courage, the unyielding kindness that shone from her like a beacon. And in the chest of the architect of ruin, in the barren, empty vault where his heart used to be, something stirred. A flicker, a fault line in the ice. He was intrigued. He was shocked. The king had just witnessed an act of rebellion in his own court, not of violence or ambition, but of pure, unadulterated goodness. And he did not know what to do with it. The collision was complete. Two worlds, one of shadow and one of light, had just slammed into one another with the force of a supernova, and the universe would never be the same. Damien Blackwood moved. The silence in the lobby broke as people scrambled to get out of his way, a parting of the sea for a dark god. Isabella's face lit up, her anger dissolving into a triumphant, possessive smile. She thought he was coming to her defense. "Damien, darling, thank goodness. This riffraff." He walked right past her. He did not spare her a glance. It was a cut more brutal than any physical blow, a public execution of her status and ego. He stopped a few feet from Ilara, who was still kneeling, her hand resting gently on the old woman's arm. His presence was overwhelming. A physical force, like a drop in barometric pressure before a hurricane. The air smelled of ozone, expensive wool, and something cold and metallic, like the edge of a blade. "The situation is resolved," Damien said, his voice a low command directed at no one and everyone. The security guards snapped to attention. Isabella stared, her mouth agape. "Damien, what are you doing? This nobody just assaulted me." Damien finally turned his head, just enough to pin her with his gaze. The warmth she had expected was not there. Instead, there was an arctic abyss. "My foundation's annual grant to this hospital," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion, "is being rescinded. Effective immediately." He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over a contact. "And your father's shipping contracts with my port authority are now under review for irregularities. I suspect we will find many." The color drained from Isabella's face. In the space of 10 seconds, he had not just dismissed her, he had dismantled her entire world. Her social standing, her family's wealth, gone, wiped away like a smear on a window. "No," she whispered, horrified. "Damien, you can't." "I can," he said, his voice dropping to a near inaudible threat. "And I have. Now leave, before you embarrass yourself further." Utterly broken, Isabella Thorne fled, a crimson blur of humiliation. The lobby was now deathly quiet. Damien's attention returned to the two women on the floor. He looked at the old woman, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Confusion, a ghost of a memory. Then his gaze settled on Elara. She looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was terrified. This man radiated a danger so profound it felt like it could stop her heart. Yet she did not look away. He saw the smudges of exhaustion under her eyes, the defiance in her chin, the unwavering compassion in her expression. He noticed a small streak of what looked like dust on her cheekbone, and for a wild, insane moment, his hand twitched with the urge to reach out and wipe it away. He clenched his fist at his side, crushing the impulse. "Julian," he said, his voice rough, "see to it that the lady is taken care of. A full evaluation. Private suite. The best care." He was talking about the old woman, but his eyes never left Elara. "And you," he said, his voice softening just a fraction, a change so subtle only someone paying rapt attention would notice. "What is your name?" "Elara," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "Elara Vance." He held her gaze for a moment longer, memorizing her face. "Elara," he repeated, the name a strange, foreign thing on his tongue. Then he turned and walked away, his long coat sweeping behind him, leaving a wake of cold air and unanswered questions. Elara didn't get the job she interviewed for. She received a polite, form-letter rejection an hour later. The crushing weight of her reality came rushing back. The rent, Leo, the endless shifts. The encounter in the lobby felt like a bizarre dream. That evening, as she was heating up leftover pasta that tasted like despair, there was a sharp knock on her apartment door. It was Julian. The mountain of a man filled her entire doorway, his presence sucking all the air out of the tiny, cramped hallway. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a gravelly monotone. "Mr. Blackwood wishes to speak with you." Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She thought of Isabella Thorne, of the casual, brutal way Damien had destroyed her. I don't understand." Julian simply handed her a thick, cream-coloured envelope. Inside was not a summons, but a document, a contract. She read it, her eyes widening with every line. It was an employment offer. For the position of full-time, private caregiver. The patient, the unidentified woman from the hospital lobby, now listed as Annalise. The terms were staggering. A salary that was more than she made in a decade. A luxury apartment provided. All outstanding family debts cleared. Leo's tuition, his living expenses, everything paid in full for the remainder of his degree. It was a miracle. A lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Then she read the catch. The fine print. The contract demanded absolute confidentiality, enforced by penalties so severe they made her blood run cold. It required her to sever all ties with her previous life. No more shifts at Northgate, no contact with old friends. She would be moved, isolated, and placed entirely under Damien Blackwood's control. The last clause was the most chilling. The employee will, for the duration of this contract, be considered the exclusive property of Blackwood Holdings, surrendering all personal autonomy in service of her duties. "You belong to me now." The words weren't on the page, but she heard them in the cold echo of his voice. This wasn't a job. It was a sale. She was selling her life, her freedom. "I need to think," she stammered, her mind reeling. "Mr. Blackwood is not a patient man," Julian said. his expression unchanging. "You have 1 hour." She closed the door, her hands shaking. She looked at the peeling paint on her walls, at the stack of Leo's textbooks on the table, at the final notice from her landlord. She thought of his future, bright and full of promise. And she thought of her own, a dead end of exhaustion and poverty. What was her freedom worth, if it meant his was forfeit? An hour later, when Julian knocked again, she had her answer. She had packed a single small bag. Her journey into the gilded cage began in a black car with windows so tinted the city became a blur of abstract light and shadow. They drove to the heart of the metropolis, to the gleaming spire that housed Damien Blackwood himself. The penthouse was breathtaking, a palace in the sky, all glass and chrome and impossible views. It was the most beautiful place Alara had ever seen, and the coldest. It was a fortress, not a home. There were no photographs, no clutter, no signs of a life lived, only the stark, brutalist perfection of Damien's control. Julian led her not to the main living area, but to a separate wing, accessed by a private elevator. It had been converted into a state-of-the-art medical suite. It had a bedroom, a sitting area, and an array of monitoring equipment, all brand new. In the center of it all, sleeping peacefully in a comfortable bed, was Annalise. Damien was waiting for her, standing by the window, a dark sentinel against the glittering cityscape. "You came," he said. It was not a question. "I had no choice," Alara answered, her voice trembling slightly, but laced with a sliver of her earlier defiance. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. A fleeting, dangerous thing. "Everyone has a choice, Alara. You simply chose the one I wanted." He stepped closer, invading her personal space, forcing her to tilt her head back to look at him. "Your duties are simple," he continued, his voice a low murmur. "You will care for her. You will see to her every need. You will not ask questions about who she is or why she is here. You will report only to me. In return, all your worries are erased." He paused, his frozen eyes boring into hers. "The contract you signed is ironclad. You understand what it means. You belong to me now." There it was. The declaration. The final click of the lock on her gilded cage. Alara swallowed, her throat dry. She looked from his impossibly cold face to the sleeping form of the vulnerable woman in the bed. She had made a deal with the devil. But maybe, just maybe, she could do some good here, in the heart of his darkness. "I understand," she said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. He held her gaze for a moment longer, as if searching for a crack in her resolve. Finding none, he gave a curt nod. "Good. Your work begins now." He turned and left, the doors sliding silently shut behind him, leaving Alara alone in the silent, luxurious prison with her patient and the ghost of her former life. The days that followed bled into a strange, surreal routine. Alara's world shrank to the confines of the medical wing, a space of quiet hums and soft beeps, suspended 1,000 feet above the world she once knew. Annalise was her sole focus. The old woman was adrift in the fog of severe dementia, her moments of lucidity as rare and fleeting as sunbeams in a storm. She was prone to fits of agitation, of weeping for a life she couldn't quite remember, of calling out names that had no faces. But Alara was patient. She was a bastion of calm in the chaos of Annalise's mind. She learned the old woman's rhythms, the subtle shifts in her mood. She discovered that Annalise was terrified of the dark, so she left soft lights on at all hours. She found that the scent of lavender was soothing, so she placed small sachets of it around the room. One afternoon, during a particularly bad episode, Annalise was thrashing, her eyes wide with a nameless terror. In a moment of pure instinct, Alara began to hum, It was an old lullaby her own mother used to sing to her, a simple, gentle melody. Miraculously, Annalise went still. Her frantic movements ceased. She turned her head towards the sound, her cloudy eyes focusing on Ilara with a startling clarity. "That song," Annalise whispered, her voice a fragile, rusty thing. I know that song." A tear slid down her weathered cheek. For a single, breathtaking moment, the fog lifted, and there was someone home in her eyes. Then, just as quickly, the moment passed, and she was lost again. But Ilara now had a key, a small, precious tool to reach the woman trapped inside. She did not know she was being watched. From a security hub in his office, Damien Blackwood observed her every move. He watched her gentle hands, her tireless patience, her quiet, unshakable kindness. He saw her coax a smile from Annalise's lips with a spoonful of pudding. He saw her reading aloud from a book of poetry, her voice a soft melody in the sterile silence. He saw her hum the lullaby that seemed to anchor the old woman's drifting soul. He was the architect of ruin, a man who dealt in demolition and destruction. And here, in his own home, this woman was building something. She was constructing bridges of kindness into a shattered mind. She was creating a sanctuary of peace in the heart of his fortress. It was fascinating. It was terrifying. He found himself drawn to the medical wing, manufacturing reasons to be there. He would claim to be checking the equipment, reviewing the medical charts. But he was there to watch her. One evening, he found her asleep in a chair by Annalise's bed, a medical textbook fallen into her lap. She looked so young, so vulnerable. The harsh lines of exhaustion were smoothed away in sleep. A strand of her dark hair had fallen across her cheek. The same irrational impulse from the hospital lobby returned, stronger this time. He reached out, his fingers hesitating just an inch from her skin. He wanted to feel if it was as soft as it looked. He wanted to tuck the strand of hair behind her ear. He snatched his hand back as if burned, his heart, that useless, atrophied organ, pounding in his chest. What was this woman doing to him? She was an employee, an asset, a solution to a problem. But his cold, logical mind could not explain the strange, protective fury he had felt when Isabella threatened her. It could not explain the pull he felt toward her, this magnetic force that drew him out of his sterile void and into the warmth of her light. The next day, the true earthquake struck. It arrived not with a tremor, but with the quiet click of a briefcase opening. A private investigator, a discreet man with nervous eyes, who Damien kept on a permanent, exorbitant retainer, stood before him in his office. "We found her, Mr. Blackwood," the investigator said, his voice hushed. He slid a thick file across the vast expanse of the marble desk. Damien stared at it. For months, he had poured a small fortune into a ghost hunt, a final, foolish attempt to find the woman who had given birth to him and thrown him away. He wanted to look her in the eye and show her the king he had become. He wanted to see regret in her face. He opened the file. The first page was a birth certificate. His own. It listed his name, and the name of his mother, Annalise Dubois. The blood drained from his face. He flipped the page. There was a photograph, a black and white image from 40 years ago. A young woman, barely 18, with wild silver blonde hair and eyes full of a frightened hope. It was her. It was the woman in his medical wing. It was Annalise. The investigator's report laid out the tragedy in cold, hard facts. Annalise Dubois, from a wealthy but cruel family. She had fallen in love with a boy her family disapproved of. When she became pregnant, they had locked her away. After the birth, they had taken the baby, Damien, and left him at an orphanage, telling Annalise the child had died. The grief and trauma had shattered her mind. She'd had a complete breakdown, spending years in and out of institutions before falling through the cracks of the system, becoming one of the city's nameless, homeless ghosts. The file did not whisper. It screamed, "I found your real mother." His entire empire, his entire life, was built on the foundation of that first, primal wound of abandonment, the belief that he was unwanted, discarded. It was the fuel for his ambition, the ice in his veins, and it was all a lie. She hadn't thrown him away. They had stolen him from her. They had broken her. The cold, empty throne room of his soul was suddenly flooded with a tidal wave of emotion, so violent it nearly brought him to his knees. 40 years of rage, of grief, of a longing he never knew he had, crashed over him. He looked at the security monitor. Elara was brushing Annalise's long silver hair, her movements tender and reverent. She was caring for his mother. The only person in the world who had ever shown his mother an ounce of kindness was this girl, this stranger he had bought and caged. His fascination with Elara suddenly crystallized into a terrifying, brilliant clarity. It wasn't just attraction. It was something deeper. He had seen in her the same gentle soul his mother must have once possessed. He had brought her here to care for a stranger, but fate, or some other cosmic force, had brought her here to care for the one person in the universe he was connected to by blood. His sacred vulnerability. It wasn't just a memory in a silver frame anymore. It was a living, breathing, broken woman in the next room. And Elara was her guardian angel. The architect of ruin looked at the woman on the screen, the unbreakable dove, and knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he could never let her go. His gilded cage had just become a sanctuary. And he, the monster, was now its fiercest protector. The revelation changed everything. The air in the penthouse grew thicker, charged with an unspoken current that flowed between Damien and Elara. Damien's visits to the medical wing became more frequent, his excuses flimsier. He would linger in the doorway, a silent, brooding statue, watching as Elara read to Annalise or gently coaxed her to eat. He saw the way Elara never spoke down to his mother, the way she treated her with a profound, unwavering dignity, as if she were a queen in a forgotten kingdom. She spoke to the woman Annalise had been, not the ghost she now was. One evening, he entered to find Elara sitting on the floor, sorting through a box of old photographs the investigator had recovered. They were images of a young Annalise, vibrant and full of life. "I thought," Elara said softly, not looking up at him, "that it might help. To see herself. To remember." He knelt beside her, an unfamiliar, awkward movement for a man who only ever stood above others. He picked up a photo of Annalise on a beach, laughing, the wind whipping through her hair. A dull, heavy ache settled in his chest. This was the mother he had never known, the life that had been stolen from them both. "She was beautiful," Elara whispered, her voice full of a gentle sorrow that was for him, not for herself. He looked at Elara then, her face illuminated by the soft lamplight, her expression one of pure, unselfish empathy. The barrier around his heart, already fractured, began to crumble into dust. Yes, he heard himself say, his voice thick. She was. It was the most honest thing he had said to another human being in his entire adult life. The unspoken attraction between them became a living thing, a silent character in the drama unfolding in the penthouse. It was in the way his eyes tracked her every movement, the way her breath hitched when he entered the room unexpectedly. He started leaving things for her. A rare first edition of the poetry book she'd been reading, left on the table in the sitting area. A specific type of tea she had once mentioned enjoying, suddenly stocked in the kitchenette. A cashmere blanket draped over the chair she always fell asleep in. He never acknowledged the gifts. She never thanked him for them. It was a silent conversation, a language of actions that spoke louder than words ever could. But his world was not built for softness. It was a kingdom of wolves, and the scent of a new precious vulnerability had drifted on the wind. Marco Valenti, a rival of equal ambition but lesser cunning, had been circling Damien's empire for years, waiting for a crack in the fortress. He found it in the form of Marcus Blackwood, Damien's cousin. Marcus was a man hollowed out by jealousy. He had grown up in Damien's shadow, resenting his power, his wealth, his absolute control. He saw the arrival of Annalise and the strange, gentle nurse as a weakness, a distraction, a fatal flaw in the architect's design. For a promise of power and a suitcase full of money from Valenti, Marcus provided the key. A temporary security code, a 10-minute window when the impenetrable penthouse would be vulnerable. The attack came without warning. It was a Tuesday night. The city lights glittered below, oblivious. Elara was humming the lullaby, settling Annalise for the night. Damien was in his office, reviewing shipping manifests, the cold calculus of his business a familiar comfort. Then came the explosion. A concussive force rocked the entire building. Alarms, shrill and frantic, blared to life. Red lights flashed, painting the sterile corridors in the color of blood. Damien was on his feet in an instant, his mind a razor-sharp computer processing the impossible. Breach. Hostile. Julian was already at his side, a weapon appearing in his hand as if by magic. Penthouse level. North corridor. The north corridor. The access point to the medical wing. A cold, primal terror, unlike anything Damien had ever known, seized him. It bypassed his logic, his control, his carefully constructed emptiness. It was pure, animal fear. For them. For Elara. For his mother. "Seal the rest of the building," Damien snarled, his voice a guttural command as he grabbed his own weapon from a hidden compartment in his desk. "No one gets out. Everyone inside is a target." Valenti's men, clad in black tactical gear, swarmed into the penthouse. They had been told the wing housed Damien's vault, his servers, the heart of his financial empire. They were expecting electronics and gold bars. They found a terrified old woman and a nurse who moved to stand in front of her, a fragile shield against the tide of violence. Gunfire erupted in the main living area as Julian engaged the first wave of attackers. The sound was deafening. In the medical wing, 2 of Valenti's thugs burst in, their weapons raised. They saw Elara and Annalise, their expressions twisting in confusion. "This ain't no vault," one of them grunted. "Grab the old lady," the other ordered, his eyes cruel. "Leverage." He lunged for Annalise. Elara moved, shoving a medical cart in his path, but he batted it aside with contemptuous ease. He grabbed Annalise by her thin arm, hauling her from the bed. She cried out, a thin, reedy sound of pure fear. He pressed the cold muzzle of his gun to her temple, using her frail body as a shield. "Stay back, little nurse," he sneered at Elara, "or Granny gets it." In his office, Damien watched this unfold on a security monitor, his blood turning to ice. He saw the gun to his mother's head. He saw Elara, her face pale with terror, but her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective fire. He saw the thug's sneering face. The architect of ruin ceased to exist. In his place was a son, a man, a beast woken from its slumber. He began to run, a primal roar of fury building in his chest. Back in the wing, Elara's mind was racing faster than it ever had. Panic was a useless luxury. She had to do something. The thug holding Annalise was focused on the door, expecting Damien. His partner was watching her. And then, Elara did the one thing they could never have anticipated. She took a deep breath, and she began to hum. The lullaby? The soft, gentle melody cut through the tense, violent air. It was an act of profound, insane defiance. The thug holding Annalise grunted in confusion. "What the hell are you doing?" But the song wasn't for him. It was for Annalise. The old woman, who had been rigid with terror, suddenly went limp, her head lolling to the side as the familiar sound penetrated her fear. Her dead weight surprised the thug, forcing him to readjust his grip for a critical half-second. It was all the time Elara needed. With a cry that was part fear and part fury, she grabbed the heaviest object within reach, a solid steel medical tray, and swung it with all her might. The edge of the tray connected with the thug's temple, with a sickening crack. His eyes rolled back in his head. He didn't fall, but he staggered, his grip on Annalise loosening, his gun arm dropping. In that exact instant, the doors to the wing burst open. Damien was there, a figure of pure, unrestrained lethality. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes burning with a terrifying light. He took in the scene in a fraction of a second. The dazed thug, his mother stumbling, Elara with the bloody tray in her hands. The world dissolved into a blur of motion and violence. Damien moved with a speed that was inhuman. The fight was not a fight. It was an execution. It was over in seconds, a brutal, efficient display of the lethality he usually kept hidden beneath layers of bespoke wool and icy control. When it was done, the two thugs lay still on the pristine floor. The room was suddenly, shockingly silent, save for the lingering echo of gunfire and the ragged sound of breathing. The air was thick with the metallic tang of gunpowder and blood. The alarms had been silenced, replaced by an even more terrifying quiet. Elara stood frozen, the heavy tray still clutched in her white-knuckled hands. Her arms trembled, not from the weight of the tray, but from the adrenaline and the horror of what she had just done. Annalise was huddled on the floor, weeping softly. Damien was a vision from a nightmare. He was splattered with blood, not his own. His chest heaved, his perfect suit was torn, and his eyes were wild, blazing with the aftermath of battle and an emotion so raw, so potent, it scared her more than the gunman had. He ignored his mother. He ignored the bodies on the floor. He ignored Julian, who now stood guard at the door, a silent, grim statue. His entire universe had contracted to a single point. Her. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his movements stiff, almost convulsive. He looked like a man holding himself together by sheer force of will. He stopped in front of her, so close she could feel the heat rolling off him. He reached out and wrenched the bloody tray from her hands, letting it clatter to the floor. His hands were shaking. The architect of ruin, the king of an empire, was shaking. And then he grabbed her, his hands tangled in her hair, fisted in the back of her simple uniform, pulling her against him with a force that knocked the air from her lungs. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't tender. It was desperate. Primal. He crushed his mouth to hers. The kiss was not a kiss. It was a collision. It was a desperate, possessive claiming, a raw expression of the terror that had just ripped through him. It tasted of blood, of fear, of gunpowder, and of a soul-shattering relief. It was the kiss of a man who had just stared into the abyss and seen his entire world about to be swallowed by it. He poured all his fear, all his rage, all the terrifying, nascent love he felt for her into that single brutal act. He finally tore his mouth away, his forehead resting against hers. His breath came in ragged, harsh gasps. "I thought I lost you," he rasped, his voice a raw, broken thing she had never heard before. The icy control was gone, incinerated in the fire of his fear. "I saw the gun. I saw him. And I thought they took you from me." Elara could only stare, her lips bruised, her body trembling in his arms, her mind reeling. The monster was gone. In his place was a man, a terrified man, He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his own burning with a vow, a promise forged in blood and violence. "Never again," he growled, the sound vibrating through her chest. "They will never touch you again. They will never touch her again." His gaze was a furnace. "I will burn this entire city to the ground before I let anyone harm you. Do you understand me?" She could only nod, her heart hammering a wild, frantic rhythm that matched his. In the bloody, violent aftermath of the siege, in the heart of his fortress, Damien Blackwood had not just confessed his fear. He had confessed his heart. Later, after Julian and his cleanup crew had erased all evidence of the violence, leaving the penthouse as sterile and silent as it had been before, Damien found her. She was in the sitting area, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, staring out at the city lights that seemed so distant and unreal. Annalise was sedated and sleeping peacefully, blissfully unaware of the storm that had just passed. Damien had changed. He wore a simple black sweater and dark pants. The blood was gone, but the intensity remained, a low hum of energy beneath his skin. He stood for a moment, just watching her. "The contract is void," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. Alara turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "You are not my employee," he continued, walking slowly toward her. "That arrangement is over. It was a transaction, and it is no longer sufficient." He stopped before her, his gaze unwavering. "You are not leaving this place. You are not a caregiver for hire. This is your home now. Because it is where I am. It is where she is." He took a breath, the words tasting foreign, difficult. "That woman, Annalise, is my mother." He told her everything, the story from the file, the lie he had lived, the truth that had upended his entire existence. He laid the foundation of his soul, bare before her, showing her the primal wound that had shaped him into the monster the world knew. He was giving her the one weapon that could truly destroy him, his own truth, his vulnerability. When he finished, the silence in the room was profound. Alara looked at him, at this terrifying, powerful man who was now so utterly exposed, and she saw past the king, past the killer. She saw the abandoned boy who had just found his mother, only to almost lose her again. She reached out and laid her hand on his arm, a simple, gentle touch. He flinched, as if her touch were fire, but he did not pull away. "You're not a monster, Damien," she whispered. A harsh, humorless laugh escaped him. "Don't lie to me, Alara. I am what I am. But you are not. And I will not let my world corrupt you." He covered her hand with his own, his grip tight, possessive. "But I will not let you go either." He had elevated her, from employee to confidant, from a possession to a partner, from a dove in a gilded cage to the keeper of the king's heart. Just then, Julian appeared in the doorway, his face grim. He held a tablet. "Sir," he said, his voice tight with a cold fury of his own, "we found it! We found the breach!" He handed the tablet to Damien. On the screen was security footage, a timestamp from 10 minutes before the attack. It showed a figure, his face clear as day, tapping a code into a secondary security panel, deactivating the perimeter alarms for the north corridor. It was Marcus, his cousin. The face of the betrayal was the face of his own blood. Damien stared at the screen, and the fragile human warmth that had filled his eyes moments before was extinguished, replaced by the arctic cold of the abyss. The architect of ruin had returned. And now he had something to protect. The purge was not swift. It was meticulous. It was a symphony of destruction, composed and conducted by a master of the art. First came the retribution for Marco Valenti. Damien did not simply kill him. That would have been too merciful. Instead, He systematically dismantled Valenti's life, piece by bloody piece. He used his vast financial network to trigger a collapse in Valenti's front companies. He leaked information to federal agencies, tying Valenti to crimes that would see him buried under a mountain of legal battles for the rest of his life. He turned Valenti's most trusted lieutenants against him with promises of power and threats of annihilation. Within a week, Marco Valenti was a king without a kingdom, a man hunted by his former allies and the law. Damien let him twist in the wind for 3 more days, letting the terror and paranoia consume him. The final act was poetic. Damien had Julian arrange for Valenti to be cornered in the very warehouse where he had first plotted the attack. Damien did not go himself. He watched on a live feed, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. He watched as Valenti, a broken, weeping mess, was confronted by the men he once commanded. Their justice was far more brutal and personal than anything Damien would have ordered. He felt nothing as he watched. It was simply balancing the equation. Then he turned his attention to Marcus, to family. He summoned his cousin to the penthouse. Marcus arrived, arrogant and oblivious, assuming he was there to be praised for his feigned loyalty during the attack. He found Damien waiting for him in the vast, empty living room. Julian stood by the door, a silent promise of what was to come. "Cousin," Damien said, his voice deceptively calm, "thank you for coming." "Of course, Damien. Anything." "I was horrified when I heard what happened. If I had been here," Marcus began, the false sympathy dripping from his words. Damien held up a hand, silencing him. He gestured to a tablet sitting on the coffee table. "I have something for you to see." Marcus picked it up. His face went from smug confidence to ashen horror as he watched the footage of himself, clear as day, betraying his own family, betraying Damien. He dropped the tablet as if it were burning hot. It shattered on the marble floor. "Damien, it's not what it looks like," he stammered, backing away. "Valenti, he forced me. He threatened my family." "You don't have a family, Marcus," Damien said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. He began to walk slowly toward his cousin, a predator closing in. "You have a wife who despises you and children who fear you. You betrayed the only family you had. For money. For a throne you are not fit to sit on." Marcus stumbled backward, his eyes wide with frantic terror. "Please, Damien! Blood is blood! Blood!" "You can't." Damien stopped in front of him. He looked down at the pathetic, trembling man who shared his name. There was no anger in his eyes, only a vast, cold emptiness, a finality. "You coveted my throne, cousin," Damien said, his voice a cold, ironic retort. The only humor he ever displayed was the dark wit of a death sentence. "You should have known it was built on bones." He paused, letting the words sink in, letting the terror peak. "Now, you can be part of the foundation." He turned his back, a silent dismissal. He did not need to give an order. He did not need to watch. He walked away as Julian stepped forward to collect the debt. The purge was complete. The threats were eliminated. His fortress was secure once more. A time of quiet descended upon the penthouse. Several months passed. The seasons changed outside the vast windows, but inside, a new climate was taking hold. The cold, sterile fortress began to change. Flowers appeared in vases, not the ostentatious arrangements of a florist, but simple, elegant bouquets that Alara arranged herself. The scent of lavender and old books began to permeate the air, chasing away the sterile nothingness. The penthouse was slowly, imperceptibly, becoming a home. Damien found himself drawn to it, to the quiet domesticity he had never known. He would come home from his brutal world of shadows and power, and the first thing he would do is seek her out. He would find her in the medical wing, sitting with his mother, who was calmer now, more peaceful than he had ever seen her. Annalise's moments of lucidity were still fleeting, but in them, she would look at Alara with a deep, trusting affection. Sometimes she would even look at Damien, a flicker of confused recognition in her eyes, and her hand would reach for his. He would let her hold his hand, his large, calloused fingers, which had ended lives and signed contracts worth billions, enveloped in her frail, gentle grasp. And he would feel a sense of peace that all his power and money could never buy. His relationship with Alara solidified into something deep and unspoken. They were not lovers in a traditional sense. Their intimacy was not born of romance, but of shared trauma, of secrets, of a profound and mutual dependency. He was her protector, her anchor in this dangerous new world. She was his conscience, his light, the keeper of his rediscovered soul. He was still the architect of ruin to the outside world. But inside the walls of his home, he was just Damien, and she was just Alara. And they were a family. The final piece of the transformation was yet to come, the unveiling of his queen. The Blackwood Medical Center was hosting its annual charity gala, the glittering pinnacle of the city's social calendar. It was being held by a stroke of poetic irony in the very same ballroom lobby where Alara had first defied Isabella Thorne. "I want you to come with me," Damien said to her one evening. It was not a request. It was a statement. "I don't belong in that world," Alara said quietly, looking down at her simple clothes. "You belong where I am," he countered, his voice firm but gentle. "It is time they saw you." The night of the gala, a series of boxes arrived at the penthouse. Inside was a gown the color of a midnight sky, studded with tiny crystals that glittered like a private constellation. There were shoes, jewelry, a team of stylists. When Alara was ready, she looked in the mirror and did not recognize the woman staring back. The image was of a queen, regal, confident, beautiful. But when she looked into her own eyes, she saw that the core of her was unchanged. The kindness was still there, the compassion, the unbreakable spirit. Damien was waiting for her. He was in a classic black tuxedo, a study in lethal elegance. When he saw her, he stopped breathing for a moment. All the words he could never say were there, in the raw admiration and fierce pride in his eyes. He held out his arm. "My queen," he murmured, the words for her alone. She took his arm, her hand resting on the hard muscle beneath the fine fabric. Their arrival at the gala caused the entire room to fall silent. Whispers erupted like wildfire. The city's elite stared, their minds struggling to process the sight. Damien Blackwood, the cold, untouchable king, had a woman on his arm. And it was not a socialite, not an heiress. It was a nobody, a ghost from a forgotten incident months ago. But she did not look like a nobody now. She radiated a quiet power, a grace that outshone all the gaudy diamonds in the room. Her chin was held high, her gaze steady. She was not his accessory. She was his partner. Across the room, Isabella Thorne watched them, her face a mask of bitter envy and defeat. She was a pariah now, her family's fortune crippled, her social standing destroyed. She was looking at the woman who had taken everything from her, not through malice, but simply by being better, by being worthy. Later in the evening, as Damien was cornered by fawning business associates, Alara stepped away for a moment of quiet. A young waitress, her hands trembling with nerves as she navigated the powerful crowd, stumbled. A tray of champagne flutes tilted precariously. Alara moved without thinking, her hand shooting out to steady the tray. A few drops of champagne sloshed onto the floor. The waitress went pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry, ma'am, please. I'm so sorry." She was expecting to be screamed at, to be fired. She was expecting the cruelty of the powerful. Instead, Elara smiled a warm, genuine smile. The same smile she had given Mrs. Gable. The same smile she'd given a lost old woman in this very lobby. "It's all right," Elara said softly, taking a napkin and kneeling down to wipe the small spill. "It's just champagne. No one is hurt." She looked up at the terrified girl, who couldn't be much older than Leo. "Take a deep breath. It's a stressful night." As she stood, she discreetly pressed a folded $100 bill into the girl's hand. "For your trouble." The waitress could only stare, speechless, a tear of relief welling in her eye. From across the room, Damien watched the entire exchange. He saw the act of grace, the effortless kindness. He saw that the power and the wealth had not touched her soul. She had not become like them. She had brought her light into his darkness and refused to let it be extinguished. And the love he felt for her in that moment was a vast, overwhelming thing, a force more powerful than his entire empire. The final scene is not one of power or glory. It is one of peace. They are back in the penthouse. The city glitters below, a silent, distant kingdom. The air is warm, filled with the soft sounds of a home. Elara is sitting by Annalise's bed, reading from a children's book of fairy tales. Annalise is awake, her hand holding Elara's, her gaze calm and focused. For the first time, there is a sustained lucidity in her eyes, a deep, peaceful recognition. Damien stands in the doorway, unseen, watching them. He is not wearing a suit. He is not the architect of ruin. He is a man watching the two halves of his heart. Annalise turns her head and sees him. A slow, fragile smile spreads across her face. "My son," she whispers. The words a miracle, a gift beyond price. He walks into the room and kneels by her bed, taking her other hand. Elara moves her chair back, giving them space, her eyes shining with tears of joy for him. The king has finally found his family. The monster has been tamed, not by chains or by force, but by the relentless, redeeming power of love. The story's moral is simple, whispered in the quiet of the penthouse fortress that became a home. True power is not in the empire you command, but in the sanctuary you build. True wealth is not the gold in your vault, but the warmth of a hand in yours. And even the darkest, most broken soul can be saved, not by a queen, but by a dove. An unbreakable, unyielding, and utterly magnificent dove